I raised my champagne, celebrating the biggest merger of my career. When my sister grabbed the microphone, "I am 3 months pregnant," she declared to the silent penthouse. "And the father is your husband," she smirked, waiting for me to break down. Instead, I took a sip and smiled. What she did not know was that my husband had a vasectomy 4 years ago, and my private investigator was already standing up. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and continue creating more content for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. My name is Athena Carroll, and I am 34 years old. The crisp night air of Seattle wrapped around the rooftop terrace of the Four Seasons, serving as a glittering, flawless backdrop for the absolute pinnacle of my professional life. I stood at the edge of the glass balcony, looking out over the illuminated skyline, the city lights reflecting brilliantly off my custom-tailored emerald silk gown. Tonight was the gala celebrating my official ascension as the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Horizon Dynamics, a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate. Everything had to be perfect, and it was. Waiters in immaculate white coats weaved through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. The champagne flowed endlessly, crystal glasses clinking in a continuous symphony of wealth, power, and untouchable success. 500 of the most influential figures in the Pacific Northwest tech moguls, state senators, media tycoons, and industry titans were gathered under the stars specifically to honor me. Standing faithfully by my side, resting a heavy, reassuringly warm hand on the small of my back, was Julian, my charming, devastatingly handsome venture capitalist husband. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than a luxury car, his hair perfectly styled, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. To anyone looking at us from the outside, we were the ultimate, untouchable power couple. I smiled up at him, my eyes sparkling under the ambient lighting, projecting the flawless image of a woman who was deeply, helplessly in love with her soulmate. It was the perfect illusion, a masterpiece of a facade. The string quartet situated near the ice sculptures had just finished a soft, elegant classical piece, signaling the time for the main toast. I was preparing to step up to the grand crystal podium to deliver my speech when the sharp, violent screech of microphone feedback pierced the elegant murmur of the crowd. Every single person in the room flinched. I turned my head, my smile freezing in place. There, standing center stage under the blinding, harsh spotlight meant for me, was my younger sister, Chloe. Chloe made a living as a lifestyle influencer, a career built entirely on heavy digital filters, manufactured social media drama, and a desperate, ravenous hunger for public attention. Tonight, she wore a silver dress that was far too sheer and entirely inappropriate for a high-level corporate gala. Her lips painted a glossy, venomous crimson. She tapped the microphone forcefully, drawing the bewildered gaze of 500 elite guests away from me and directly onto her. "Excuse me, everyone," she purred into the microphone, her voice dripping with artificial, sickly sweetness. "I know tonight is supposed to be all about my big sister, Athena, but since we are all gathered here like one big, happy family, I felt this was the perfect, intimate moment to share some incredible, life-changing news of my own." She paused deliberately, letting the silence stretch out over the rooftop terrace, savoring the heavy, suffocating anticipation she had just created. Then, she locked her dark eyes directly with mine and let her lips curl into a vicious, triumphant smirk. "I am 3 months pregnant." A polite, scattered ripple of applause began to echo from the back rows of the venue, guests assuming this was a joyous family announcement, but Chloe immediately raised her hand to cut the applause off. "Thank you," she said, her tone abruptly dropping its sweetness, turning sharp, bitter, and utterly lethal. But the best part is the father. You see, the father of my baby is my sister's husband, Julian. The collective gasp from the crowd literally sucked the oxygen out of the penthouse. The silence that instantly followed was absolute, a heavy, paralyzing, dead shock. 500 incredibly powerful guests froze in place, their eyes darting wildly between the lit podium, Julian and me. Down in the front row, our parents looked completely, physically horrified. My mother's trembling hand flew up to cover her mouth as all the color drained rapidly from her aged face. My father looked as if he was about to have a heart attack right there at the dinner table. Slowly, deliberately, I shifted my gaze to Julian. He looked like a man who had just been dragged against his will to the executioner's block. His signature golden boy complexion turned a sickly, pale ash gray. Thick beads of cold sweat instantly broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the terrace lights. His hand violently dropped from my back as if my silk dress had suddenly caught fire, taking a frantic, cowardly step away from me. Up on the stage, Chloe's smirk widened until it consumed her entire face. She stood there, bathing in the toxic scandal, eagerly waiting for my inevitable, catastrophic breakdown. She wanted the hysterical tears. She wanted to see my expensive mascara running down my face in ugly streaks. She wanted me to scream at her, to violently slap Julian across the face, or to turn around and run away crying from the absolute ruin of my perfect life, utterly shattered in front of Seattle's highest elite. But I did not shatter. I did not give her a single drop of the satisfaction she craved. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath of the cold night air, letting the chill center my racing heart. I calmly handed my half-full champagne flute to a frozen waiter standing nearby. With perfect, lethal posture, my head held high, I began to walk toward the podium. The dense crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, people physically shrinking back from my blast radius, terrified of the impending explosion. I stepped up onto the elevated platform, standing directly shoulder to shoulder with my treacherous sister. She looked genuinely confused by my icy composure, a sudden flicker of real doubt finally crossing her smug eyes. Without breaking eye contact with the crowd, I reached out, gently but firmly took the microphone from her trembling hand, and gave it a sharp, crisp tap. I looked out over the sprawling sea of shocked faces, holding the silence hostage. Then, I turned my head to look directly at Julian, who was practically shaking by the ice sculptures, and I flashed him a smile so terrifyingly cold it could freeze the blood in his veins. Without saying a single word to my sister, I raised my free hand and made a subtle, sharp gesture toward the darkened, inconspicuous corner of the room. Right on cue, Marcus Vance, my private investigator, pushed his chair back from the shadows and stood up. To understand the sheer audacity of my sister standing on that stage, you have to understand the sick, twisted foundation our relationship was built upon. I was the architect of our family's survival. Chloe was the wrecking ball dressed in designer clothes. Growing up, our parents drowned in blue-collar debt. The moment I graduated, I swore I would never let us live in that suffocating anxiety again. I threw myself into the corporate meat grinder, working 80 hours a week, sacrificing my youth, my sleep, and my sanity to drag our family out of the working-class mud. Within 5 years, I paid off their mortgage. I became the sole provider. Chloe, however, was born to be the golden child. While I built an empire, she built a hollow aesthetic. She was a professional victim, leveraging a pretty face and a manufactured aura of fragility to manipulate everyone around her. She called herself a lifestyle influencer, but her real full-time job was leeching off my success. Her lavish apartment, her weekly spa treatments, her curated vacations for social media, all of it was quietly financed by my platinum credit cards. "You are just so strong and capable, Athena," she would pout, swiping my card for a $5,000 handbag while recording a tearful video for her followers about the overwhelming burdens of mental health. "I just need a tiny bit of help until my sponsor pays me." That sponsor payment never existed. I was her endless, unconditional ATM, constantly guilt-tripped by our parents to take care of my fragile little sister. Then Julian entered my life, to the world, and to me. He was the missing piece of my perfect puzzle. He was sharp, ambitious, and seemingly in awe of my relentless drive. Finally, I had an equal, a true partner. But to Chloe, my absolute fulfillment was an unbearable personal insult. She could not stand the fact that someone else was the center of my universe. She was biologically incapable of allowing me to have something flawless while her own life was a chaotic mess of credit card debt and superficial relationships. So, like a parasite sensing a new host, she locked her sights on my husband. She weaponized the role of the cool, understanding little sister-in-law with terrifying precision. It started subtly, right under my nose. She would drop by our townhouse unannounced, wearing oversized sweaters that constantly slipped off one shoulder. She cultivated private inside jokes with Julian, laughing too loudly at the dinner table while shooting me a look of faux innocence. "Julian just gets my weird sense of humor," she would giggle, placing a hand on his forearm for 2 seconds too long. Then came the late-night intrusions. My phone would stay dark, but Julian's screen would light up at 2 o'clock in the morning. "It is just Chloe," he would whisper, typing rapidly in the dark. "She is having a panic attack over some guy she is dating, just asking for a male perspective." Looking back, I should have burned the house down right then, but I did not. I let it slide because my trust in Julian was absolute, borderline arrogant. I was managing a multi-billion-dollar company. I simply did not have the mental bandwidth to entertain petty domestic paranoia. I brushed off her boundary-breaking as pathetic, attention-seeking behavior from an insecure girl who desperately needed male validation because she possessed zero actual substance. I thought she was just being impulsive. I failed to realize that her impulsivity was a calculated siege on my marriage. Eventually, the cracks in my perfect foundation grew too large to ignore. The changes in Julian were microscopic at first, but to a woman trained to spot corporate anomalies, they began to scream like sirens. The man who used to enthusiastically break down his venture capital portfolios with me over morning coffee suddenly became fiercely territorial of his laptop. He changed his passwords. When I casually asked about our joint investment accounts, he offered vague, convoluted excuses about complex market fluctuations and tied-up assets. His schedule, once an open book, morphed into a maze of ghosts. A 2-day networking trip to San Francisco would mysteriously stretch into 4 days, with long gaps of unexplainable radio silence. But the most glaring, unforgivable shift was his sudden, aggressive defense of Chloe. Whenever I finally hit my breaking point and threatened to cut off her $50,000 annual allowance, Julian would instantly step between us. "Do not be so harsh on her, Athena," he would argue, his voice thick with an unearned, protective empathy that made my stomach turn. "She is just a kid trying to find her way in a tough industry. You have everything. Let me handle her finances. It is the least we can do." He was not protecting my sister. He was protecting his personal investment, and that was the exact moment I realized I was sleeping next to a stranger. The definitive turning point occurred exactly 5 months before the gala. I was reviewing our quarterly asset allocations late on a Tuesday evening when I noticed a glaring discrepancy. A massive withdrawal had been executed from one of our secondary joint accounts. $250,000 had simply vanished, rerouted through a labyrinth of shell companies before completely disappearing. Julian was a venture capitalist. Complex money movement was his native language, but this was incredibly sloppy. It was not a strategic investment. It was a hemorrhage. The next morning, the final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap. I was taking his bespoke wool overcoat to the dry cleaner when I felt a stiff piece of paper crinkle inside the inner breast pocket. I pulled it out. It was a crumpled receipt from a small electronics store located 3 towns over, dated 2 days prior. The item purchased was a prepaid, untraceable cellular device, a burner phone. A man with a multi-million-dollar portfolio does not buy a $50 burner phone with cash unless he is hiding a life he cannot afford to lose. I did not confront him. I did not scream, or throw a glass at the wall, or demand immediate answers. Instead, I quietly folded the receipt, slid it back into his pocket, and made a single, encrypted phone call. Enter Marcus Vance. Marcus was not your average, run-of-the-mill private investigator who chased cheating spouses with a cheap camera. He was a former federal financial investigator who had left the government to open a highly exclusive, ruthlessly efficient intelligence firm. He specialized in corporate espionage, asset recovery, and annihilating the dirty secrets of Seattle's elite. I met him in a dimly lit, soundproof conference room in an empty office building downtown. I slid a thick dossier containing Julian's entire financial footprint across the table. "I want you to tear his life apart," I instructed Marcus, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Leave no stone unturned, follow the missing money, trace the burner phone, and document every single shadow my husband casts." Marcus went to work with terrifying systematic efficiency. He did not need months to find the truth. He only needed 3 weeks. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Marcus bypassed my secretary and walked straight into my executive suite. He did not say a word. He simply placed a heavy manila envelope onto my mahogany desk. My hands were perfectly steady as I unclasped the seal and poured the contents onto the polished wood. Dozens of high-resolution, time-stamped photographs spilled out. My breath hitched violently in my throat, freezing my lungs. There they were, my husband and my sister. Marcus had tracked Julian's burner phone pings and his erratic schedule to a secluded, ultra-luxury boutique hotel tucked away in the wealthy, forested suburbs of Bellevue. The photos were a chronological, sickening documentation of my absolute betrayal. There was Julian, his hand resting possessively on Chloe's lower back as they walked into the private hotel entrance. There was Chloe, laughing hysterically at something he said, looking up at him with a gaze of pure, unfiltered adoration. And the most devastating photos of all were taken from a discreet angle at the hotel's private outdoor restaurant. They were not just sneaking around for a quick thrill, they were sharing an intimate dessert, holding hands across the table, acting with the comfortable, terrifying intimacy of a genuinely married couple. He looked at her the exact way he used to look at me during our first year of marriage. I dismissed Marcus with a blank expression, maintaining my ironclad composure until the heavy oak door of my office clicked shut. Then, my entire world shattered. I collapsed. My knees hit the cold, unforgiving hardwood floor of my office, and I let out a sound that I did not know a human throat could produce, a raw, suffocating gasp of pure, unadulterated agony. For 10 years, I had built my entire life around this man. I had trusted him with my deepest vulnerabilities, my finances, my heart, and my future, and he had taken all of it, wrapped it up, and handed it to the one person who had spent her entire miserable life trying to steal my light. I spent exactly one night mourning the death of my marriage. I lay on the floor for 8 solid hours, crying until I was physically sick, violently purging every ounce of love, grief, and weakness out of my system. I let the agonizing pain hollow me out entirely. When the sun finally began to rise over the Seattle skyline, casting long, pale rays of light through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I slowly stood up. I walked into my private bathroom and looked at my swollen, bloodshot eyes in the mirror. I splashed freezing cold water on my face. The woman who had fallen to the floor the night before was dead. The woman looking back at me in the mirror was empty, cold, and dangerously calculating. Most wives in my position would have hired a divorce lawyer immediately, caused a messy public scene, or confronted the cheating pair in a fit of hysterical rage. But blind jealousy is a weapon for the weak. It is messy, it leaves room for excuses, and it gives the traitors a chance to spin the narrative. I refused to be a victim in my own life story. I did not just want to leave Julian. I wanted to obliterate him. I wanted to burn his reputation to ash, dismantle his fragile ego, and expose Chloe to the brutal, unforgiving reality of the consequences she had earned. I picked up my phone, dialed Marcus Vance's personal number, and told him the investigation was far from over. I was going to weave a net so tight, so impeccably reinforced with hard evidence, that when I finally snapped it shut, there would be absolutely no escape for either of them. The investigation did not stop at cheap hotel rooms and stolen kisses. As Marcus dug his claws deeper into Julian's digital and financial footprint, the horrifying reality of my situation truly began to take shape. The affair, as disgusting as it was, turned out to be nothing more than the superficial symptom of a much more aggressive terminal disease. Julian was not just unfaithful, he was a thief, and my sister was his inside man. 2 weeks after discovering the Bellevue Hotel photographs, Marcus called me into his office for a second time. He did not offer me a seat. Instead, he pointed to a sprawling web of printed bank statements, wire transfer logs, and encrypted emails pinned across his large corkboard. It looked like the schematic of a massive organized crime syndicate. "The venture capital firm is a smokescreen," Marcus explained, crossing his arms. "His prized flagship startup filed for bankruptcy protection 3 months ago. He is drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt, and his investors are preparing to tear him apart. He desperately needs a massive, untraceable influx of cash to cover his tracks and avoid federal prison." My private, ironclad inheritance trust fund was the perfect target. The only problem was that my security protocols were completely impenetrable from the outside. That was exactly where my dear sister came into play. Marcus handed me a stack of server access logs. "Your husband could not hack your accounts," Marcus stated, his voice low and steady. "So he used a Trojan horse. He used Chloe." The puzzle pieces slammed together with sickening clarity. All those unannounced visits, the time she asked to use my home office to print out her meaningless influencer contracts, the time she lingered near my desk while I typed in my master passwords. Chloe was not just a pathetic, needy sibling. She was an active corporate spy. She had been methodically harvesting my security tokens, photographing my private financial ledgers, and handing the keys to my kingdom directly to Julian, in exchange for selling out her own flesh and blood. Julian had promised to drain my accounts, finalize a quick divorce, and take her away to live a life of endless luxury. They were planning to leave me completely bankrupt and entirely alone. A cold, hollow laugh escaped my throat. It was a brilliant, vicious plan. But criminals always make mistakes, and Julian's fatal flaw was his own insurmountable arrogance. He thought he was the smartest person in every room, perfectly manipulating both of the Carroll sisters like pawns on a chessboard. But Marcus had uncovered something else, something that proved Julian was deceiving absolutely everyone, including his willing accomplice. Marcus walked over to his desk and picked up a single, heavily redacted medical file. He slid it toward me. "I found this buried in a Shell Corporation expense report," Marcus said. "He paid out of pocket, under a fake name, at a highly discreet private clinic down in Portland, but the biometric registry matches." I looked down at the crisp white paper. It was a surgical invoice dated exactly 4 years ago. The procedure listed was a permanent, irreversible vasectomy. I stared at the medical code, my brain violently refusing to process the information. 4 years ago, for the past 4 years, Julian and I had supposedly been trying to start a family. I had endured countless agonizing rounds of fertility treatments. I had sat in sterile doctors' offices, crying into my hands after every negative pregnancy test, completely convinced that my high-stress career had broken my body. And every single time, Julian would hold me in his arms, kiss the top of my head, and tell me that we would keep trying. He watched me inject hormones into my stomach. He watched me blame myself for our failure to conceive. And he had known, every single second of every single day, that it was biologically impossible. He had mutilated his own fertility just to avoid the inconvenience of fatherhood, and he let me carry the crushing weight of that failure entirely alone. But as the initial wave of profound grief washed over me, a massive, glaring contradiction suddenly struck me like a runaway freight train. If Julian had a vasectomy 4 years ago, and it was permanent, then he was completely sterile. I looked up at Marcus, my eyes widening in absolute disbelief. "Chloe's pregnancy," I whispered, the realization sending a violent shockwave through my nervous system. If he is shooting blanks, whose baby is she carrying? Marcus allowed a rare, grim smile to touch his lips. That is the exact question I asked myself. Athena, so, I took the liberty of cracking your sister's secure cloud backups. He tapped a key on his laptop, and a new set of images illuminated the large monitor on the wall. These were not taken from the shadows by a private investigator. These were selfies, saved in a hidden, password-protected folder on Chloe's personal drive. The man in the photos with my sister was not Julian. It was Vance Sterling. I physically had to grab the edge of the heavy mahogany desk to keep from falling over. Vance Sterling was not just another wealthy socialite. He was a ruthless, cutthroat billionaire and the single most dangerous competitor Julian had in the entire venture capital sector. Sterling despised Julian. He had spent the last 5 years actively trying to destroy Julian's reputation, poaching his clients, and humiliating him in the financial press. Sterling was also married to a fiercely protective, terrifyingly powerful woman whose family practically owned half the commercial real estate in Seattle. I began reading the recovered text messages between Chloe and Sterling scrolling across the screen. They were desperate, frantic, and entirely damning. Chloe had been having a reckless, prolonged affair with Sterling. When she discovered she was pregnant, she panicked. Sterling, terrified of his wife discovering the infidelity and destroying his empire in a brutal, highly publicized divorce, threatened to utterly ruin Chloe if she ever attached his name to the child. He cut her off completely, leaving her stranded with a ticking time bomb in her womb. Chloe was backed into a corner. She needed a scapegoat. She needed a man who was wealthy enough to support her, arrogant enough to believe he was invincible, and gullible enough to accept the paternity without demanding immediate medical proof. She chose Julian. The sheer, magnificent irony of the situation washed over me. A dark, poetic justice so perfectly orchestrated it felt almost supernatural. Julian believed he was the ultimate puppet master. He thought he was using my sister's foolish infatuation to orchestrate a massive financial heist, planning to steal my fortune and eventually discard her once the money was secured in offshore accounts. He thought he was the predator. But in reality, he was the prey. Chloe was not a helpless victim manipulated by an older, wealthier man. She was a cornered animal manipulating him right back. She was using Julian to cover up her filthy, catastrophic mistake with his absolute worst enemy. She was going to let Julian blow up his marriage, steal my money, and then trick him into raising Vance Sterling's child for the rest of his miserable life. They were two parasites, secretly feeding off each other, each completely convinced they were the one holding the leash. I stood up slowly, a terrifying, electric energy surging through my veins, replacing every ounce of sorrow I had ever felt. The tears from weeks ago were a distant, pathetic memory. I looked at the undeniable evidence scattered across the room, the bank statements, the vasectomy records, the photos of my sister wrapped around my husband's worst enemy. I did not just have enough ammunition to ruin them, I had exactly what I needed to make them publicly, spectacularly destroy each other on the biggest stage imaginable. The rooftop terrace of the Four Seasons remained trapped in a suffocating, dead silence. 500 elite guests held their collective breath, their eyes darting from my perfectly calm face to the trembling figure of my husband, and finally to my sister, whose triumphant smirk was beginning to falter at the edges. She had expected a screaming match. She had expected me to flee. She never anticipated Marcus Vance. Marcus did not rush. He navigated the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos with the slow, deliberate stride of an executioner ascending the scaffold. The crowd instinctively parted for him. He walked straight past the intricate ice sculptures, past the string quartet, and approached the main audio-visual control station positioned right beside the grand crystal podium. The event technicians, entirely intimidated by his cold, unyielding demeanor, stepped back without uttering a single word of protest. Marcus pulled a sleek silver flash drive from his jacket pocket and slid it into the primary console. He tapped a few keys. Behind me, the massive 2-story digital projection screen that had been proudly displaying the corporate logo of my company suddenly went completely black. I raised the microphone back to my lips. My voice, when it echoed across the penthouse, was as smooth and unyielding as polished obsidian. "Chloe," I began, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "You have always had a flair for the dramatic. Announcing your pregnancy at my corporate gala is certainly a bold choice. You claim that Julian is the father. You claim that the two of you are going to run away together, start a beautiful family, and live happily ever after." Chloe narrowed her eyes, her manicured fingers gripping the fabric of her silver dress. She did not understand what was happening, but the primal animal instinct of genuine fear was finally washing over her carefully contoured face. "However," I continued, turning my gaze slowly toward Julian, who was currently clutching a high cocktail table to keep his knees from buckling, "there is just one minor biological impossibility standing in the way of your beautiful fairy tale." I gave Marcus a subtle nod. He hit the enter key. The massive screen behind me roared to life, a collective gasp, louder and far more violent than the first, ripped through the audience. Projected at 20 feet tall, illuminated for every tech mogul, state senator, and high society socialite in Seattle to read, was a highly confidential, heavily redacted medical invoice. "As you can see," I announced, gesturing casually to the towering document, "this is a surgical record from a highly discreet private clinic in Portland, dated exactly 4 years ago. The patient listed is Julian, the procedure listed, which was paid for entirely out of pocket and marked explicitly as permanent and irreversible, is a vasectomy." I paused, letting the clinical, undeniable reality of the words sink into the brains of 500 guests. "Julian is completely 100% sterile. He has been shooting blanks for 4 years. So, my dear sister, unless this is an immaculate conception, my husband absolutely cannot be the father of your baby." The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Julian let out a choked, guttural sound, like a man who had just been violently stabbed in the stomach. His head snapped toward the digital projection screen, his eyes bulging out of his skull as he stared at his own deeply buried medical secret, now broadcast to his entire professional network. But then, the true horror of the situation hit him. The gears in his manipulative, calculating brain finally ground to a violent halt. He turned his head slowly, stiffly, to look at Chloe. He had thought she was carrying his ultimate ticket to a quick fault-based divorce. He had thought she was completely devoted to him, willing to be his perfect pawn in a multi-million-dollar heist against my trust fund. Now, staring at her pale, terrified face, he realized the agonizing truth. She had lied to him. She had used his own affair against him, playing him for an absolute fool to secure a wealthy sponsor for a bastard child that was not even his. "No," Julian rasped, his voice cracking, completely forgetting the massive audience watching his every move. "No, Chloe, you swore to me. You said we were having a son." "It is a mistake," Chloe shrieked into her microphone, her voice high-pitched and utterly hysterical. She was panicking, wildly flailing for any possible lifeline. "That document is totally fake. My sister forged it because she is a jealous, bitter woman, or maybe the surgery failed. That happens. The doctor said there is always a 1% chance of failure. It is your baby, Julian. I swear it on my life." She was rapidly unraveling, the glamorous influencer facade melting away to reveal the desperate, cornered fraud underneath. She reached out, trying to grab Julian's arm to anchor herself, but he violently shoved her hand away, stumbling back as if she carried a deadly plague. "A 1% chance," I echoed, letting out a soft, chilling laugh that reverberated through the sound system. "You have always been terrible at math, Chloe. But fortunately, Marcus is exceptionally good at research." I did not even have to look at the control station. Marcus was already pressing the button for the next slide. The medical document vanished. In its place, a series of 4 crystal clear, high-definition photographs filled the 20-foot screen. They were taken in broad daylight. They showed Chloe, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf, stepping out of the heavily guarded front doors of an exclusive prenatal clinic in downtown Seattle. She was not alone. Walking right beside her, holding her elbow in a tight, possessive grip, was a man with distinct silver hair and a sharp, cruel profile. He was not wearing a mask. His face was entirely visible, completely undeniable. The whispers in the crowd did not just erupt. They exploded into an absolute uproar. Every single person in the financial sector recognized the man on the screen immediately. It was Vance Sterling, Julian's ultimate, most hated corporate rival. "It seems," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic shouting of the crowd like a surgical blade, "that while Julian was busy sneaking around cheap hotels in Bellevue, you were busy warming the bed of his biggest competitor. You got pregnant by Vance Sterling. Vance threatened to destroy you if you exposed him, so you panicked. You needed a rich, stupid scapegoat to foot the bill, and you found the perfect idiot right here in my husband." The sheer humiliation of my words struck Julian with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled backward, knocking over a silver tray of champagne flutes. The expensive crystal shattered violently across the floor, perfectly mirroring his destroyed ego. He was not the mastermind. He was the laughingstock. He had thrown away a brilliant, fiercely loyal wife, a multi-billion-dollar empire, and his entire professional reputation, all for a woman who was actively sleeping with the man who wanted to ruin him. He was going to spend the rest of his life being mocked as the man who proudly volunteered to raise Vance Sterling's illegitimate child. But the absolute climax of the disaster was not Julian's psychological breakdown. It came from the VIP tables, situated right at the edge of the stage. A woman stood up. It was Eleanor Sterling, Vance Sterling's wife. She was a woman who possessed more inherited wealth and ruthless social power than anyone else in the Pacific Northwest. She had attended the gala tonight as a platinum sponsor, completely unaware that she was about to witness her own husband's filthy infidelity broadcast on a 20-foot digital billboard. Eleanor did not scream. She did not cry. She simply picked up her heavy crystal water goblet and hurled it directly at the projection screen with terrifying, violent force. It shattered against the metal framing, raining glass down onto the stage. "You disgusting, pathetic little fraud," Eleanor hissed, her voice carrying over the chaos. Her furious gaze locked onto Chloe like a heat-seeking missile. "You are dead in this city. Do you hear me? I will make sure you cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee in Seattle ever again." Chloe dropped the microphone. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening screech. She covered her face with her hands and finally began to sob. The ugly, hysterical tears she had so desperately wanted to pull from me now completely consuming her own face. She looked toward our parents, sitting in the front row, but they were frozen in absolute horror, unable and entirely unwilling to look at her. I stood tall at the podium, untouched by the flying glass, untouched by the screaming, untouched by the absolute carnage unfolding around me. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had crushed them both into dust. Julian collapsed entirely. The realization that he had been played by a 26-year-old amateur completely shattered his fragile ego. Right there, in front of the most powerful people in the city, he fell to his knees. The shattered crystal crunched beneath his expensive trousers, but he did not seem to notice. He crawled toward the edge of the stage, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. "Athena, please," he sobbed, his voice stripped of all its former charm. "You have to believe me. She tricked me. Chloe manipulated me into doing this. She spun a web of lies. I never wanted to leave you. I love you. Please, we can fix this. Just give me one more chance." I looked down at the pathetic, weeping shell of the man I used to call my husband. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, clinical emptiness. "You are right about one thing, Julian," I said softly, stepping back from the edge of the stage. "She did manipulate you, but you are the one who opened the door, and unfortunately for you, my patience ran out exactly 5 months ago." I raised my hand one final time and gave a sharp nod toward the back of the venue. The heavy oak doors of the rooftop terrace swung open with a resounding crash. 4 men and 2 women wearing dark suits and severe expressions strode into the room. Their badges caught the glare of the crystal chandeliers. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus Vance had not just handed the evidence of Julian's financial crimes over to me. 3 days prior to the gala, he had delivered a massive, heavily encrypted hard drive directly to the federal authorities, detailing every single shell corporation, illegal wire transfer, an act of corporate fraud Julian had committed to keep his sinking startup afloat. An agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Julian, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. You have the right to remain silent." Julian let out a scream of pure terror as they hauled him roughly to his feet. He thrashed, begging for mercy, but the agents simply dragged him away, his cries fading down the emergency stairwell. On the stage, Chloe turned her desperate, tear-stained face toward the front row. "Mom, Dad, you have to help me, please," she wailed, reaching her hands out to the only people who had ever blindly protected her. Our father stood up slowly. He looked at the daughter he had babied for her entire life, his expression hardening into stone. He did not say a single word. He simply offered his arm to our mother. She took it, tears of absolute shame and disgust streaming down her own face, and they turned their backs on Chloe. They walked out of the gala without looking back a single time, completely and permanently severing ties with their toxic, deceitful child. 1 year later, the dust had finally settled. Julian was convicted on multiple felony counts and is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison, having lost every single dime of his wealth and his professional reputation. Chloe's life became a living nightmare. Eleanor Sterling made good on her promise. Chloe was blacklisted by every single brand, agency, and social circle in the country. She lost all her influencer contracts overnight. Vance Sterling ruthlessly abandoned her, legally ensuring he would never have to claim the child or pay a single cent of child support. She now lives in a tiny, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a minimum wage job while raising her baby entirely alone, completely isolated from the family she betrayed. As for me, I am standing on the private balcony of my new corner office. I was unanimously voted in as the chairperson of Vanguard Horizon Dynamics. The Seattle wind whips through my hair as I look out over the sprawling city skyline, holding a fresh cup of coffee. I take a sip and smile, realizing a profound truth. The most perfect, devastating revenge is not about getting your hands dirty or screaming in the dark. It is simply stepping aside, turning on the lights, and letting the traitors dig their own graves with their very own lies. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for tuning in to Maya Revenge Stories today. We would love to know where you are listening to this story from, so please let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's journey and felt satisfied with this ending, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description or pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our dedicated staff so they can feed their families and continue creating even better stories for you. Thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day.